Hello and welcome to the Unusual Stories podcast. My name is Wojciech. I'll be your host for today. And before we begin, may I just remind you, if you find this podcast entertaining, interesting, useful, or in any way, shape, or form enhancing your life or the life of your friends, colleagues, and family members, then please do not refrain from following and subscribing and basically enhancing and empowering the podcast in any shape or form. The best way to go about it is probably just to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform, and as well the best kind of advertising really is the word of mouth. So if you can reshare one of my posts to your colleagues, or maybe send them a link to the episode, maybe share it with a friend. That's basically it. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the podcast in any other way, then please follow the link below. There is an option for a donation. There is an option to subscribe to a newsletter, or just send me an email and pat me on the back kind of thing. And of course, if you'd like to comment on one of the posts and just let me know about a new book that I should review, or maybe that something needs changing, maybe it would be wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much for all of you who are supporting in so many ways. I feel very grateful for that. And of course I do enjoy doing this, but it definitely doesn't hurt to feel every now and then the empowering words, or sort of acknowledgement of some sort. And so I appreciate you. Thank you for that. Now let's begin. Today I have a very unusual book for you. It wasn't even planned. I didn't even plan to read this book. It's one of those that just popped in quite organically, if I may say so. So the book's name is The Next 100 Years, and it's written by George Friedman. And basically it's a sort of a prediction, maybe, somewhat of a sketch of what George Friedman, who is an expert in geopolitics and history, and I guess an avid reader and an analyzer of history, trying to predict back in 2009, when the book was published, what the next 100 years will look like. And exactly that's why I've chosen to include it in the podcast. You might probably wonder right now, well, that's completely crazy or off the charts nuts to be predicting the next 100 years, even if we cannot really predict the next year. And that's a fair point. But going with the quote from Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so what George Friedman poses in his book is not necessarily a fully fledged plan of what's going to happen in the next 100 years. Rather, his perspective of what could happen if certain activities were to follow. And his main assumption could probably be summarized in a sort of an attitude of curious and expecting the unexpected kind of a category. So the two quotes that I've written that I want to share with you at the very beginning of the book, of this book review, let's say, is be practical, expect the impossible. And the second one, the unexpected should be expected. And so, you can kind of get a feel here of what kind of attitude the author, offers us in the book itself. The book is sort of divided into decades, or somewhat of thematic sections. They seem to be decade based, but some of them span a longer period, and some of them some chapters focus on a particular aspect of whatever. So for example, one chapter is dedicated fully to technology, and then out of that chapter there are some developments made in other areas regarding where that technology is likely to impact the world. And so I was thinking, first of all, I find this really, really interesting and curious. The attitude of learning about the past to understand what might the future hold is a very practical one, right? There is a certain value and quality in, and that inherently I assume this is why we are brought up by our parents, who are obviously more experienced, and then grandparents who are even more experienced, that in a way, if you've had a chance to live long enough to experience a few different crises, a few different opportunities, a few different, major shifts of the world, you're more likely to at least have an understanding that the world that you know today is not necessarily the world of tomorrow. And I guess that's the main point, that even though we might kind of know where we're heading, and in some areas we might not even be wrong, there is a certain uncertainty out there, which is likely to consist of uncertainties going forward. And for the benefit of you as maybe a younger person, or for you as a person in your prime time, having around you wise old people who have more experience than you, people who have had a chance to experience the maybe some not necessarily pleasant, but certainly educating experiences in their lifetime, you might be better equipped to approach the future challenges. And if anything, I was thinking, which book this reminds me of, or maybe which book could I tie into this podcast. And one that came into my mind is the book by Ray Dalio called Principles, right? The ideas that Ray Dalio poses in his book and in his work overall, the idea of maybe adapting to the changing world order and such. There is a certain flow, a certain rhythm, maybe a certain rhyme, as Mark Twain said, to history. And in the same way that empires rise and fall, in the same way, maybe the way I perceive it is in the same way our blood is pumping through our heart, and maybe we are born, we sprout, we open up as this beautiful flower of full potential. We do our part, and then at some point we die, right? We pass on to the next, whatever that next may be. So in terms of the next 100 years, George Friedman poses some ideas in terms of who is likely to be the leading nation of the century, which nations, which countries, which geopolitically based players on this chessboard of the world are likely to emerge, which are likely to maybe deteriorate, and also what different new avenues might we be exploring. And at the very beginning of the book, he makes a good point that he will not be there to see it happen, the majority of it. And so it will be up to his children and grandchildren to sort of review and see whether he was right or wrong. Now, my promise to you, my dear listener, is that I will do a review of this book and its prophecies, if you will, in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. So as I continue with the podcast, God willing, up until the end of mine, I'm planning to do at least one more, maybe even two reviews of this book, just to sort of recall and see where Mr. Friedman might have been right and where might he have been wrong. For today, my plan is to mostly share with you some of the ideas from the book while giving you a chance to read it yourself. And in the next episode I will do about the book in the next maybe 20 years, I will make sure to focus more on those particular, sort of prophecies already. So today I will mention some, but for the most part I want to explore major topics, major themes that I've gathered from this book that might be useful for you. And going forward, maybe we can focus a bit more on the prophecies themselves. So in terms of this idea of learning about the past to understand the future, as we said, it might be beneficial, and it certainly is beneficial from my perspective, to read books and biographies and learn about great works, great people of the past, and great events of the past, simply because it might enhance your ability to deal with the present. Not necessarily to predict the future, but even just to be more skillful in dealing with your present situation. It is very likely that majority of things that happen for you in your lifetime will be somewhat similar to what happened to other people. And the universal, the existence and the sensations and the troubles and tribulations of our life as humans are quite universal. And you might be living in a different community, you might be speaking a different language, you might be having slightly different backgrounds and so forth, but in general, we are experiencing this human experience as spiritual beings in a very similar manner. The colors might change and the tastes might change, but the underlying issue, I think, stays the same. Now, let's start with the first point. We've already discussed this idea. I said the quote that be practical, expect the impossible. And the invitation of the author, especially at the very end of the book, is for you to think of what you expect will happen in the next 100 years. And then based off of that, start asking yourself questions to doubt these ideas. So, for example, his thesis, let's say, is that we would not expect 20 years ago what is happening right now based on the knowledge of 20 years ago. 100 years ago, people did not know what would happen right now either, right? It's quite natural that even in a few years' time, we will be inevitably surprised by some new emerging developments and experiences. But the thing is, if you do have, for example, already a certain set of expectations for the next few years, then from the perspective of Mr. Friedman, the most practical approach you can have to this, if you do need to, for whatever reason, for work reasons, for career reasons, or for reasons of having a nice conversation with a friend, if you need to predict some sort of a future, then figure out what you think will happen, write it down, and then start picking it apart and trying to, even in a way, ask questions that would make your ideas and your expectations completely reversed. So if you are expecting that in the next 20 years we will be flying to Mars, then let's make the assumption that maybe someone is flying to us in those next 20 years instead. So you know what I did there? It's just a simple example, I guess. The point being, whatever you do think and expect, you should ask yourself and try to find other routes, sort of a tree, if you will, a branch of, many branches of a tree of this idea of the future, with the assumption that you should expect the impossible and you should expect the unexpected. So whatever you think is impossible right now, well, at some point it probably will be possible, unless it's something that is a sort of a universal truth, but there is not that many of them. And then obviously expecting the unexpected in a way that you provision for those in your thinking. And I don't really think it's that useful to be too concerned about 20 years from now. It will be useful for you to be concerned about your and your families and your immediate, maybe close friends and family well-being in the next 20 years. But that doesn't mean you need to analyze the geopolitical situation, in the Middle East for the next 20 years, or you don't need to know where Canada will be in the next 15 years for you to decide how to arrange your family life in Poland over those next 15 years. So there is a certain level here of simple entertainment and appreciation of just articulating yourself in a manner that is interesting. And I do think it's an interesting conversation to have, even if it's not necessarily a most practical one. Now, obviously, there are some jobs that necessitate predictions, and so, for example, as we discussed the book Thinking Fast and Slow and the book The Black Swan by Mr. Nassim Taleb, in both of these books, what the authors were presenting us with is the fact that we are very ignorant and we are very unlikely to make predictions that are good predictions. So we should approach it with a level of humility and appreciation for our ignorance. And I think that's essential, especially if your life depends on it, or especially if your work depends on it. So, as I said, some jobs might have the necessity for predictions, especially if it's, some sort of a military related job, or maybe foreign affairs, maybe it's a political position, or maybe it's the financial markets. But even people such as Ray Dalio in his work, and obviously he's one of the goats in terms of the financial markets and how to play them, even they reassure us again and again that we are unlikely to know, and therefore we should make provisions for what we do not expect to happen. And so there is this famous quote I've shared with you so many times already from Ray Dalio: if you do not worry, you have to worry. If you do worry, you don't have to worry. And so obviously, if you do prepare for the unexpected in whatever shape or form, you're more likely to not be affected negatively if and when that unexpected occurs. Now, I'll just write down here Black Swan, yeah. So I don't forget. I'll link below those two episodes as well, Thinking Fast and Slow and Black Swan, for you to review at your own time. Now, an interesting thing that I want to maybe delve here into is this idea that the author suggests that geopolitics and life in general is a sort of a chess game. And so an interesting insight that I've gained from the book was this idea that in a chess game, a good chess player is not necessarily the one that knows the best kind of moves, rather the one that can quickly and efficiently recognize the least positive, least opportunistic moves and not execute them. So instead of striving for perfection of one, of that one special move, trying to be as efficient with understanding which moves not to take. And this is this idea of the law of constraint, right? So at any given moment, you have a constrained number of possibilities to choose from. If I am sitting here right now recording and discussing this idea for you on a podcast, I have a limited number maybe of activities I can do. Of course, that amount is fairly broad. I could suddenly stand on the desk, or maybe I could break the wall behind me. I could turn off the recording. I could disappear under the desk. I could stop talking and just stare at you blankly. But there is still a certain limit to that. And now if we take it back to the geopolitical maybe or the world stage, even though it might seem there are so many options for countries to choose from what to do, for nation states to choose from what to do, from a perspective of a good strategist, according to Mr. Friedman, a good strategy expert will know that the majority of these options that maybe a person like myself, who is not an expert in geopolitics and strategy, would think are those options. A good expert, a strategist, will know that they are not favorable, and so they are unlikely to happen. And so obviously it's a kind of a game. It's like the chess board. Of course, in chess you can still make a blunder for the point of making the opponent taking a step towards you as you set a trap. But for the most part, according to the author, there are certain predicaments that nationalities and nation states and corporations and big bodies of people are unlikely to engage in, even though it might seem like a likely opportunity, simply because the opportunity cost there is just too high. And so the something that really struck me as true maybe, and I just remember being touched by it, is this idea that there are two laws that play major part in shaping our world and ourselves. One is the law of constraints, and the second one is law of unintended consequences, right? So the law of constraints is obviously this idea that you have a limited number of options to choose from at any given moment, and even though you might be exercising some level of free will, as long as you're skillful, you're likely to be choosing out of a few rather than out of the whole plethora of options. And then the second law is the law of unintended consequences. And this, simply put, is what we do not expect will happen when we do something. So, a classic example, I guess, is you decide to leave a bit earlier for work because that way you will be on time. But since you left a bit earlier for work, you didn't follow your routine, and so you forgot something, and so you need to come back, and so you end up actually being late to work. And obviously this is just a simple example, but it can go much further than that, right? We try to help someone and then we make the situation worse. And this is not to say you should not try to help someone, but this is to say you should recognize and be aware that there are likely some unintended, unknown to you consequences that might appear in your life after the act is taken. We simply cannot foresee the future, and there are many situations. And there is this very famous on this podcast, because I'm pretty sure I've quoted it a number of times by now, a Polish saying that claims that I assume in English it might be quite similar, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And so it's this idea that you have maybe even a noble approach, a noble idea. You hope to make the world a better place through what you do. But of course, there are unintended consequences that might arise. And a very, for example, podcast relevant situation might be that, I have the intention of sharing some of great insightful ideas with you from the books that I read, but the unintended consequence that might appear is that someone watches one of the episodes and finds it very, offensive for whatever reason. Maybe they had a bad day, and then they promote it online as something really, really unreasonable and negative, and then I get in trouble. And so, I've not had any intentions whatsoever to get into this discussion with that potential, unhappy customer, let's say. But since the law of unintended consequences is at play, it might happen. Anything can happen. The chaos and the randomness of the world is certainly there to play tricks on us from time to time. But the very, very interesting thing about the book and how, Mr. Friedman approaches this next 100 years prediction is this idea that if you take into account the law of constraints and the law of unintended consequences, and you extrapolate from the past experiences, like let's say the past century, into the future, you can observe patterns of behavior of nation states and local communities that might be likely the kind of, outcomes that he poses. So his approach to foreseeing the future is by analyzing what happened in the past, extrapolating that, moving it sort of forward, and using it as a baseline while constantly questioning himself and his assumptions. And so I would say, for what it's worth, and I know I'm not, not the one to judge it, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed the assumptions and the understanding behind them. I also think it's quite revealing to see yet another book that seems to appreciate the rhythms, the flow of civilizations. And this is certainly something that I was not aware of up until last year, that there is a certain flow, a certain rhythm to how markets, countries, cultures, people behave. And so in a similar way as we are born, we spring, and then, we have our summertime, and then we wither and fall. In the same way, countries, nation states, civilizations, and markets do. Now, let's go off to the second part, I guess, the second big piece. And this one is a bit more geopolitically focused. The idea of cycles in culture and finance and the challenge of them is something that is greatly explored throughout the book. So the quote that I have for you here is, "A solution to last cycle is the spark in the challenge of the next one." So what the author offers us is this idea that in the same way as civilizations go through cycles, and we'll come back to that in a second, there are cycles in the markets, and there are cycles in the political, and there are cycles in our psyche and in our way of perceiving the world. And the challenge of those cycles is that there is always, the cycle consists of a certain need for potential future and a certain challenge that is here and now. And this wrestling of the society, let's say, if we talk about in terms of maybe social policies and stuff. The society is at a constant balance, maybe a wrestling match with these two areas, right? We want to go forward and explore and develop, and at the same time we want to tackle the problems, the troubles that arisen out of the yesterday's solution. And this is a very interesting thing to note, something that maybe is quite encouraging. It can also be perceived maybe slightly discouraging, depending how you look at it, that whatever solution we might find to our troubles, we are likely to encounter another trouble which will stem out of that solution. And so, in a way, the way I see it is we should not be too hasty in praising and maybe self-praising, but certainly praising others and ourselves, and sort of resting on laurels, as they say, from solving an issue when we don't necessarily know what that solution might bring us next. And obviously, if you bet all of your winnings on this one move that might end up being trouble to challenge you next, then you're basically going from one trouble to another without much control. And of course, the author doesn't actually offer us many guardrails to this trouble, to this issue. He simply proposes that this is the case. In terms of politicians, he says, if you find a politician that solves some of your troubles today, the solutions of those troubles are likely to cause other unforeseen troubles into the future. And similarly, if you have someone that, maybe have caused you troubles in the past in, your life, and you've managed to solve those troubles yourself, then you're likely to be just on the waiting edge of new troubles to appear from those solutions. In terms of life, when I think about this, I think about diet. This is the one thing that recently, over the past year, I've been quite consistent with a certain way of living. I'm intermittent fasting and I'm enjoying it. And I've been much more conscious about my eating habits and, in terms of overall consumption of substances over the past year. Obviously, we had our amazing episode last week about the ultra-processed people book. The thing is, though, if you think about changing diet of anything, maybe substituting something for something else, or maybe deciding not to eat something, or maybe deciding to try a new diet, maybe try intermittent fasting. The only way to really see whether it works is to do it long enough for you to see how it works, right? If I were to make a change every 2 months, I am unlikely to see many results in a way that would be for sure results of that change, if you know what I mean. In the same way, it's about the training regime. Those are the two areas that I think you really need to put in the effort over time and be patient to see the results of those. And maybe one more nefarious example is that of vapes. We've already discussed vapes before, right? Obviously, vaping is advertised as something healthier than contemporary smoking, I guess you could say. But since we are unable to study long-term effects of vaping on people until this long term passes, whoever is the early adopter of this new technology and exchanged the doubtful pleasure of smoking a classic cigarette to even more doubtful, in my opinion, pleasure of vaping, is unlikely to be saved from the unintended consequences in the next 10 years, right? Because maybe in 10 or 20 years time, studies will show what exactly happens to your body as you vape. But if you've done it for the past 10 years, you've likely already gotten the effects of them anyway. So, this is the challenge there. We are in the midst of it at all times, and we cannot foreshadow the future. So in a way, we can only hope that the solutions we make and the choices we take are skillful enough to not cause us more harm than the initial challenge that was overcome by that solution. Now, in terms of geopolitics, an interesting take that the author shared in his book is that of the underlying issues and the trouble of those. So the author poses that underlying issues must be resolved for conflicts to subside. So unless the underlying issue that would cause the conflict, that you might not even recognize initially as that issue, because the conflict on the face of it might be focused on resources or might be focused on the differences in culture or whatever. But if you dig deep enough and if you understand the underlying issue, you might recognize that whatever happened over the past few centuries has yet to be resolved. And so we are still in the same cycle. Now, this is in the... he actually talks about it in the case of Russia. And interestingly enough, he did predict that in the second decade of the 2000s, our century, we will have a somewhat of a Russia-United States war. Of course, one could argue right now that it is not necessarily the war between Russia and the United States. It might be considered Russia versus Ukraine. But in terms of a grander strategy, Mr. Friedman analyzes that it is within United States proxy war agenda, at least the agenda of the previous administration, let's say, to constitute that war. Now, that's irrelevant, and I don't really want to go into those topics simply because I don't know them enough. And if it was a political podcast and if it was a historical and military podcast, then fair enough. But it isn't. Maybe in a few decades, when I know more, I will be happy to offer you my thoughts. But for the time being, I'll stick to my lane and acknowledge my ignorance of the others. Now, in terms of this underlying conflict, what Mr. Friedman poses is that Russia's underlying issue is still unresolved all the way back since the Second World War. So apparently, according to Mr. Friedman, Russia's trouble in terms of the underlying issue is related to its strategic location. So because it's landlocked, majorly landlocked, it is also very dependent on building greater lengths of defense and separation from other countries, especially if considered from St. Petersburg and Moscow. Now, because after the Second World War and Soviet Union collapsed, many countries in the Eastern Europe became once again sort of a free, independent countries of the Soviet Union. This trouble of the underlying issue of Russia being too close to potential adversaries is still unresolved, which, according to the author, is likely to cause more troubles and more conflicts into the future. So, putting that aside, and this is obviously one of the prophecies for you to review whether or not the author was right, I wanted to just touch base on this in terms of kind of dealing with the underlying issue rather than dealing with the symptoms of it. And I wanted to express my thoughts here in terms of your health. I think this is a necessary talk that we've already had at least twice, especially in the context of the book The Real Anthony Fauci by Robert Kennedy Jr. That basically, if you have some underlying issue, maybe there is something wrong with your back, or maybe that's, for example, for me, maybe you have troubles with your sleep, maybe you have troubles with your stomach, maybe you have troubles with something, whatever it is. If you go to a doctor that only offers you a certain medicine to take to deal with the symptoms of it. So for example, let's say that your stomach is constantly aching, and so you get a pill that allows this pain to subside, but it doesn't actually address the problem that causes your pain in the first place. The only thing that happened is you sort of postponed solving potential solving of that issue into the future. And obviously now you're also taking some chemicals into your body as well as you're struggling. So instead of healing the cause, you're only healing the effects. And so you're kind of numbing out the pain, even though the underlying trouble is still there. From my perspective, I would wholeheartedly say this is not the way. I think you agree. If you are listening to this podcast, you're likely one of those that do agree that you should probably strike the trouble and the problem at its core rather than address only the symptoms. So maybe instead of taking pills and numbing out pain and pretending nothing happened, you should find a doctor who will be willing to explore what exactly is going on in your body, that you have this trouble in the first place. Because long term, you're likely to gain much more from a short-term kind of healing spree of figuring out what's wrong than just getting one pill to numb the pain and then for the next 20-30 years take that pill every day because you've actually not dealt with the problem. This is obviously very similar to what nation states are dealing with. If there is an underlying trouble in your society and that issue is unresolved, according to the author, that issue will re-emerge again and again and again and again, regardless of how many band-aids you end up placing on top of your, symptoms, let's say. And those symptoms obviously might vary. The horrific part about cancer as a disease is that it can attack and spread over the body in many ways that are unexpected, and so it is very difficult to treat it once it's already there. And it's obviously much more difficult than to also address the underlying issue when you don't know where it came from. So I would just urge you to, especially in terms of your health, but in terms of your life overall, try to always ask yourself, what is the underlying issue? What is the cause? What is the reason I'm having these troubles, pains, tribulations? Rather than just quickly and efficiently taking care of the symptoms and sort of kind of closing your eyes and hoping for the best without actually addressing the initial trouble. Now, one more thing maybe to say on the culture, I said we'll come back to, is an interesting idea that I don't know from where the author took. I assume it is a some sort of idea from maybe social science or politics. This idea that there are three states of culture. and they're sort of, one after the other, they develop. So the first one is barbarism, second one is civilization, and the third one is decadence. Now, barbarism is the state at which the nation state or a society is very young, and so they are sort of in the very turbulating, emotionally driven, always erratic, and kind of chaotic state. The society is developing very rapidly. There are many inventions, and it's one of those states in which the country can really, really grow. But it's also one of those states when it's the most unpredictable, and there are many, many challenges that the society and the country, the nation state, has to overcome throughout that space. And according to the author, USA is just at the end stage of the barbarism stage in terms of the cultural development, in terms of finding its place in the world, in terms of finding its way, because it is a relatively young nation state in comparison to, for example, those of Europe, which some called the old continent, right? Then you have the stage of civilization, which is basically when the nation state has a set of rules and regulations and attitudes in place that allow it to flourish in a less energetic, less dramatic way, but it's also much more stable, and it's supposedly this is the state every nation state should strive for. And then you have decadence, and of course, in terms of the decadence, what the author says is that it's the time when civilization yet again withers, right? So maybe there is too many comforts, the society grows weak, there are too many reasons to become skeptical, cynical, unappreciative, and maybe corruption creeps in, and ideas take a different and a weird turn, and become a sort of self-propelling fantasies, and fantasies of a utopia and a dystopia as a future. And it is at this stage where, apparently, according to the author, the old continent, so the majority of countries in Europe, are in. So, for example, UK, where I live, according to the author, is struggling since the Second World War, and even slightly earlier, with this state, which is the state of decadence, when it seems like nothing really matters, and so there is much less effort placed in development and growth, and the society becomes more stagnant and is likely to kind of wither, similarly to, I think, ourselves. The way I see those states of culture in our life states is barbarism is when you are growing up as a child and you're basically a little monster, and you're not really socialized, you're not really ready to join the big world in a productive manner. Then you get to the point of maybe the civilization, which is obviously the time when you become a valued member of the society. You probably are a beneficiary, but also a benefactor of the society, and you provide, you're focused on steady growth, and kind of you might not be so potential driven anymore, you might not be so energetic, you might not be so nimble as you were when you were a barbarian, but you're certainly still able to do your best. And then decadence comes, and obviously you might in terms of our life cycle, I wouldn't say the way I see decadence in our life cycle is us not appreciating life anymore. Rather, you simply, because of your age, because of your body having to take the toll of time, and because of your potential growing smaller and smaller every day, simply because there is less time for you still on this earth, you might fall into this decadence state, which is more focused on simply enjoying the moment. And so from the standpoint of a productivity, you're likely to be less of a productive individual. Of course, take it with a pinch of salt. This is just my take on it. I found it very interesting, this idea of three states of culture, and how, according to the author, this century, and this is yet another spoiler maybe, according to the author, this century will be all about the USA and basically its development into a full-fledged civilization. And so that's interesting. Let's see. As I said, I'll do a review in a couple of decades to see where we are. But for the time being, according to the author, it seems that the grand strategy that the United States, the underlying issue that the United States has to deal with, is this strategy of prevention. So since the First World War, the United States slowly but surely became a sort of a hegemon maybe of the world. There is this saying among the geopolitical experts that he who controls the ocean controls the world. And obviously after the Second World War and ever since, the USA Navy is the most powerful in terms of control all over the world. And this is why, according to the author, it will be a century of United States development and further growth, and challenges that come from that. Now, my final point is about technology. And this is an interesting one. I will share with you some, sort of bits of what the author projects. I will also tell you, I think it will be nice for you to hear, the few countries that the author points out as the countries who are likely to be either contenders or leaders among, leaders being led by United States in the next 100 years. But let's talk about technology, right? One interesting thing that I noticed straight away is that the author did not expect AI. So even though obviously there is a huge part of the book dedicated to robotics and the development of robotics and the technologies behind it and around it, there is no mention of artificial intelligence. And, come to think of it, it might just be reasonable to assume that simply the author could not expect the unexpected, right? As this development unfolded quite rapidly, really, and only recently, the author might have not had the chance to see through the veil of his ignorance. So that's interesting. Now, in terms of the technology, an interesting, really, really hopeful, from my perspective, point, because I do believe that war is hell. And, as much as I would like the world to never be at war again, I think it's quite wishful thinking. I believe that there is an inherent part in us humans that, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said in Gulag Archipelago, that the line between good and evil lines through, goes through every man's heart. Therefore, I think wars will never fully end. They might just change their shape and form. But this is the hopeful part about technology, according to the author, that thanks to technology developments, there will be a maximizing of technological, advancement and usage throughout war, while the casualties of human lives will be minimized. So, for example, instead of placing human soldiers in the battle, in the trenches, you will have many drones and technologically advanced weapons deployed, and only a few human soldiers to maybe navigate those and help those succeed. There will be also, according to the author, obviously robots in labor everywhere, and I think at this point we are already seeing it. On the production line, you're much more likely to find a robot these days than a human being, and so according to the author, that will simply just develop further, and he prophesied that in 2030 we will have mass robotic adoption. Around that time, around the decade of 2040s, we will all have robots available to us in our homes, and it will be just a classic aspect of our life. Now, another interesting thing, according to the author, space will be the next ocean. So, in a similar manner than I said that he who controls the ocean controls the world. According to the author, it will be that he who controls space controls the planet, and so. In the next 100 years, Mr. Friedman assumes that there will be yet again a space race to build space stations that are military focused, and that will be where the next sort of space navy will be placed, and this is where the United States will go. Now, another thing is the space-sun energy, and that's very interesting. We already have solar panels on the International Space Station, for example, that are obviously getting energy from the sun there. According to the author, this will be expanded, and that, according to him, there are also works already being done for decades now on developing new solutions to gathering energy from space, and we will see growth of that over the next decades, with more and more energy being taken from the sun in many forms. So that's very interesting and exciting. I think realistically, I find that kind of a solar panel much more realistic than a solar panel in Scotland, simply because we have too many clouds in the sky from time to time. So that is very very entertaining for me. A space sun energy usage, apparently. Now, finally, you might want to know which countries the author points out as the unusual, in my opinion, suspects for this coming century. So according to the author, Mexico will emerge later in 2060, 2050, 2060, as a major player and a contender to United States. And since it is placed right next to United States, it will either lead to a union of a sort or a conflict of a sort. And the three countries all over the world that, according to the author, are likely to greatly enhance their power, economic output, and sort of be empowered by the United States as well through its foreign relations, is Turkey, Japan, and, funnily enough, Poland. And for different reasons, these three, according to the author, will be leaders in their local, let's say, regions. And since the United States will want to, according to the author, the United States will want to keep a certain control over the world, these few countries will become its somewhat of allies, maybe, at least for some time. Now, as I said, these are only predictions, they are sketches, they're drawings on the water with a stick. And, if anything, I guess the point of this podcast is this episode particularly, is to entertain and inspire you. Most importantly, to inspire you to read the book. So if you think this is a book that you will enjoy, that these topics are interesting for you, and you do want to know how, in more detail, Mr. Friedman drew the conclusions he did, and maybe you just want to have this book with you over the next few decades to see what came true, I would encourage you to read it. Otherwise, I hope that at least exploring these ideas in semi-deep setting, we can enhance our lives. And it certainly did enhance mine, The part about law of constraints and law of unintended consequences, I get that now, and I truly resonate with it as well. I can see it in my day-to-day experience that there are sacrifices we make, right? 2 weeks ago, we've been talking about sacrifices from the standpoint of the Bible. We make sacrifices every day, and those sacrifices are also, even though they might seem like they're free-willed, and maybe to a certain degree they are also constrained by our circumstances, right? There is a limit to what I can do in my day, there is a limit to what I can do in my area, and there is a limit to what I can do with my body. And so it's great to push those limits, but it's also beneficial for sure to recognize where those limits lie. And that was one particular lesson from the book, that even though the book itself is geopolitical in nature, I found it particularly entertaining and insightful from the standpoint of a personal, very practical setting. So, as the author said, right? Be practical, expect the impossible. The unexpected should be expected. So yeah, I hope that this is something that inspires you and entertains. And let us remember the quote from Mark Twain: "History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes." In terms of the invitation, my invitation for you this week is quite fun. I would like you to create your own prediction for the next 75 years, let's say, since it's 2025, 75 years. Think of what will happen in the future, maybe some major situations, maybe if you think there will be some sort of a world war, whatever that means, in which decade it would happen, or maybe you want to write down some details of who would be engaged in this conflict. And yeah, write it down. See what you think, and into the future, check it back and see what you've guessed. An additional point to my invitation for you would be to send me your prediction. I would be really, really excited to hear what you think will happen. And what I can do for you is maybe at the end of next episode, next week, I'll read for you a few predictions that I will make. And obviously, we are very, very ignorant, I bet, and we are nowhere near as expert driven as Mr. Friedman about geopolitics and the world. But who is it to say we cannot play this game, simply entertain the ideas in our mind? So my promise to you is that next week I will read for you a few predictions that I am making for the next 75 years. And I hope that maybe you could send me either in the comment below or just on the email address that is available on the link, your predictions, because I'd like to hear what you think. And maybe after you read the book, you can let me know. Maybe at that point you will be also better suited to predict it. So yeah, and if you do listen to this in 2075 and I'm no longer around and my predictions came true, then yeah, share this podcast. I think at that point I do deserve a share and a like. Yeah. So yeah, other than that, have a little play, maybe with your family and friends. Think what could happen and write it down, even just for yourself. I think it might be quite an entertaining thing. I'll ask my girlfriend to do this with me, and I'll share with you next week our predictions. So yeah, other than that, as per usual, if you think this podcast is entertaining and insightful, please follow, subscribe, support. It goes a long way. It really doesn't take too much of your time, and it definitely makes my life hell of a easier. So yeah, thank you for that if you did, and thank you for listening if you found this to be fun. Other than that, have a wonderful, wonderful week. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.